Theo Usherwood is with us, a political commentator, and of course a regular with us on the programme. Afternoon to you, Theo. So here he is. He's here. French President Mr Macron has arrived with his wife. Big visit from William and Kate at the airport, and then off in a carriage somewhere else. He's met the King and the Queen. Big banquet tonight. It's not a bad gig, is it?
No, it's not. But of course, the undercurrent, what they're trying to sort out in the margins in those talks is some sort of deal which is actually going to bring the numbers of people crossing the English Channel from the north coast of France to the UK down. Now, we've given the French hundreds of millions of pounds to try and stop those migrant crossings. It's not made the blindest bit of difference. The crossings are up 50% on last year alone by this point, and Keir Starmer is hoping that he'll be able to reach some sort of a deal with Emmanuel Macron, but whereby if you've crossed the channel and you have a family member in this country, you'll be able to stay, but otherwise you'll go back to France. But this is a fiendishly complex deal, and of course we'd like to think, and the government would like to think, it's some sort of bilateral agreement with France, but of course it will have a knock-on impact when you go to Italy, when you go to other European countries, because of course the migrants continue to cross through Turkey and into Europe. That, you know, from the east, and then of course from the south and northern coast of Africa into Italy. And of course France, if it wants to sign this deal with the UK, it'll either become the bottleneck for these migrants who arrive and then become stuck in France, or there's going to have to be a pushback against migrants arriving from Italy. And of course that's by no means agreed. So it feels a little bit like a shot in the dark trying to get this agreement. And the danger, of course, is that because it's come out, because it's become public now, what you're going to see is a huge rush to cross the English Channel over the course of the summer to get to Britain before any agreement is struck.
Especially when the weather's
look like out the window, sun shining,
it's lovely. It's going to be like that for the next couple of weeks. It's a great kind of, the optics for me are interesting. I've always made this point, so forgive me if you're a regular listener, but with the Channel migrant thing, it doesn't matter where you stand on this. That you've got two countries, two leaders, two lots of military, two lots of intelligence, two home secretaries between the two lots of border force. In a world where we're almost about to land on Mars, I can make a Hollywood Pixar type movie on my iPhone through artificial intelligence. Elon Musk can reverse a rocket back into its pod, but you can't stop a bunch of guys on a boat crossing the channel. I mean, that seems unbelievable. It
does, and of course there was I saw a very to the point cartoon where they were saying, you know, we're going to stop the Russians, and we've got these new bombers that are going to be able to drop tactical nuclear weapons to save us all from the Russians. But of course, and then in the cartoon, the joke was, yes, but what happens if the Russians decide to arrive by a small boat?
Everyone's safe. Sorry, we can't touch them, Governor.
But that, you know, this is the problem, and of course, the government has, you know, and this is quite right, has said, some of your listeners might disagree, but this is something I think personally is, you know, it's made the call that it's not prepared to forcibly turn round the boats in the middle of the English Channel, because there would obviously be, certainly in the first instance, there'd be an exceptional loss of life, and that's something that they're not prepared to countenance. Now, I personally think that's the right view, but short of that, it's very difficult to see what else can be done. I mean, they even looked, you know, last government, the Tories looked at reports of wave machines. They looked at flotillas to try and stop the migrants crossing. But the other tool, of course, that they had also considered, and what the Tories had in motion, was the Rwanda scheme, a deportation scheme, whereby people would be sent directly to Rwanda. But at the moment, we remain part of the European Convention on Human Rights. There's no indication from this government, quite the opposite, in fact, that it wants to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. And so when you have migrants in this country and they're going through the system, and they can often claim Article, you know, whether it's Article 8, right to a family life, they can stay, well, you know, you got the chicken nugget excuse or whatever, that means that they can stay in this country, and we're not prepared, and they couldn't be deported under the Rwanda scheme because that would go against the ECHR.
I wonder if this is, I remember, this is not betraying anything, because the person that said it to me was fully aware and gave me permission to kind of mention it. But this was I found myself at a do, and I was talking to the permanent secretary at the Home Office. You may remember him. He was there for a long time. Now, that's an incredibly senior position.
Yeah.
Some would even argue more senior than the Home Secretary themselves. You know everything, you're across it. And I said to him, he said, if only people knew how much time we spend in that office dealing with this. He said, it's non-stop. It's non-stop. There's thousands of people only dealing with this. And I said, what's the problem then? And he said, the French.
Yeah.
And it wasn't some sort of smart, xenophobic joke. He was serious. He said, the problem is with the French.
Yeah, but also, and this is the crux of it, right? Before we had these crossings, what did you have? You had a camp at Sangatte. It was known as the Jungle.
That's right.
Do I remember that correctly?
Yeah, correct.
The French don't want that.
Yeah.
Right? They don't want that. And of course, they've got, Emmanuel Macron has his own political problems because he's got the rise of a right-wing party coming up on his tails and I know we've seen Marine Le Pen obviously, face court proceedings and so forth. But there is still discontent on the right in French politics that will make great hay if there is another Sangatte because the French suddenly turn around and do us a favour, and they're not prepared. They are not prepared to do it,
100%.
And that's why we find ourselves where we are. They won't engage, and so then it becomes about, well, why are we giving them so much money?
Yeah.
It's 700 million quid. And at the front page, I think it was the Daily Mail today, is, can we have our money back, please? That's what the Tories are saying.
Yeah.
But it was the Tories that gave them the money.
But indeed, are we going to see some, incredible announcement that puts this to bed? Well, is there going to be, the two sides have come to an agreement, they haven't revealed it yet, and everyone, Nigel Farage is going to go, oh my God, they've solved it.
No. But you know what? But you mentioned Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
Nigel Farage, his whole raison d'etre is because we have a crisis like this one.
Correct.
And it doesn't just affect what we see in Dover. You see these migrants being housed in hotels and houses of multiple occupancy right up and down the country, especially in poorer parts of the country, where those costs, hotel costs or rental costs, are much lower. It's not in the shishi suburbs of North London that you have these hotels.
Yeah.
They're trying to get value for the taxpayer, and communities are going, well, hang on a moment, you've cut my winter. This is what happened in Runcorn and Helsby. You cut my winter fuel allowance, but yet we've got 750 migrants in the constituency who are being put up at the expense of the taxpayer.
Yeah.
And so, from Nigel Farage's point of view, a little bit like the French, he has there is, the crisis works for him. It works for Reform UK. And when you had a government that actually took when you had the Boris Johnson government, and Boris Johnson has made this point fairly recently, that actually dealt with, our exit from the European Union and delivered on something that had been promised, namely the 2016 European Union referendum, that actually what happens is that Nigel Farage is basically made redundant. But of course, whilst this crisis continues to exist and whilst we see hundreds of migrants, sometimes thousands of migrants crossing each week, Nigel Farage's stock can only go up.
Indeed. Let's move to this story, Theo. Number 10 in the Treasury refusing to rule out wealth tax. This has been around for years. The suggestion has been around. Nobody ever does it. And
why? There must be a reason.
There must be a reason. Well, I can only think, it's interesting, this suggestion seems to be, and Neil Kinnock sort of waded in on this one. So the idea is with this particular, there's lots of different versions of wealth tax, but this one suggests a 2% wealth tax on assets over 10 million quid could raise 11 billion pounds. Now,
who said Lord Kinnock?
He's raised this point. But we spoke to this group called Patriotic Millionaires last week, who they want to pay more tax. In fact, you can voluntarily. There is, I can't remember the name of the form, but you can fill it out, send it off to the Treasury and put your figure in and give the money back. You're allowed to do that. I think the reason they picked assets and not wealth is because I don't think there's as many millionaires as people think in terms of earnings. But there's probably quite a lot of people in terms of owning property that collectively might be worth 10 million. The problem with that, of course, is you might own that property, but you might not have big income. So where do you get the tax from? So if you sell the property, then you cease to become one of the people that...
And then who would want to buy the property?
Well, exactly.
Because then they end up paying...
It comes with another big tax.
Look, I think what's quite instructive is that actually previously, and it was in Labour's manifesto before the election, Rachel Reeves was very clear, she wasn't going to introduce a wealth tax. But what we're seeing now is the rise on the left of the Labour Party. We saw the rebellion last week over welfare spending. Another rebellion in line to happen in the autumn over changes to EHCPs. Those are what, provide support for children with disabilities or learning difficulties. The left of the Labour Party is only gaining strength at the moment, and that's why Number 10 Prime Minister's spokesman, when he was asked about it yesterday, didn't rule out a wealth tax. Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, in effect Rachel Reeves' number 2, then goes in front of the House of Commons to answer an urgent question and repeatedly refuses to rule out a wealth tax, which he could quite easily do. But there's a real danger here, is that even if Labour doesn't introduce a wealth tax, those wealth creators, those people who invest in this country, who set up, build factories or offices or HQs in this country or buy properties in this country, decide to spend time in this country, over the summer start to think, actually, I don't want to be here any longer, because in the autumn there's a possibility of a wealth tax, and I'm going to be subject to a huge, to seeing a significant amount of my my assets suddenly be handed over to the taxman. And all the while you see places like Milan, Italy, Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, has implemented a much more favourable regime for the very wealthiest, basically a non-dom status. You see, I was speaking to somebody who's incredibly wealthy the other day, who was saying, a lot of the bankers are going to Milan now to make that there, to set up shop there, or at least have their base there. Dubai, of course, has always been very attractive for these people, and we want these people to come to the United Kingdom to make their home here. They go out, and Farage made this, and it was a valid point. They go to luxury restaurants, they pay VAT, so there's some consumption. If you start taxing wealth, people just alter their behaviour, and they'll just change their behaviour. You want to tax, and Lord Macpherson, who of course was Permanent Secretary in the Treasury, has made this point, you want to tax earnings and you want to tax consumption. That's the way you raise revenue, because ultimately the aim of the game is to put money into the Treasury's back pocket to spend on the things that we want to spend it on, not to scare the horses and get those people who pay the vast majority of tax in this country to get them running for the hills.
But there is there's another, just a final point on this. Some suggest, well, just make the top rate of tax, the very top rate, 50%, and then you end up in a situation which is kind of a full 5% over a certain threshold. I think there's two problems with that. One is the optics. The idea that you live in a country where the government takes half of your income is just not a good look for any government, even a Labour one.
But or you could do, what you could do is 45p and a pound tax kicks in at £125,000. You could reduce that threshold down to £70,000. You raise 12 billion quid, but that hits middle earners.
Of course,
it hits those. It doesn't hit. You think now, well, that will hit the very wealthiest, and £70,000, but £70,000 is a deputy head teacher. It's a nursing manager. It's somebody who's been in, works in the public sector. It's not.
It's not people with an account in the Cayman Islands.
Yeah, precisely. And they're not mobile, so they're not able to. They're not able to suddenly up sticks and head off. So you will raise the money, but people are poorer.
Yeah. Lord Tebbit, let's just a final word on this, if we could, Theo. The Thatcher loyalist. There's not really any other figure that has got such an association with the leader that they served with as Lord Tebbit. You mentioned Lord Tebbit, word association, Margaret Thatcher. It's just there. He was a big beast. He said what he felt. He was satirised on Spitting Image, and many people say exactly what the Tories need now.
Yeah, very, very much so. I think they just don't make them like Lord Tebbit anymore, and you can agree with his politics or disagree with his politics, but when you're thinking about Lord Tebbit, he was Margaret Thatcher's enforcer. He survived. His wife was paralysed from the neck down. It's very easy to just characterise him as this evil Tory baddie. He actually gave up his career 3 years after that happened to go and care for his wife Margaret, who was paralysed in the IRA bombing on the hotel in Brighton at the Tory Party conference. This was a multifaceted politician, a multifaceted human being who but had that knack of saying what he thought and had that that genuine white van man Tory, come from nothing, born in Enfield, was and hated, of course, by many within the media and the establishment. He was dubbed by one sketch writer as the Chingford Strangler after his constituency. But this was this was a formidable politician who had a way of getting to the point.
Yeah.
You know, if you think about, you don't like the question, it might make the question make you feel uncomfortable, but the Tebbit test of, you know, if you've come to this country to make this country your home, which cricket team do you support? It had that
That's
knack
right.
of
That was
just,
his other, yeah.
you know, he had that ability to just get to the point.
Yeah.
And they don't, it's from another, you know, he's from another world, another era, but we don't have politicians like that anymore, I don't think.
No, I can't. I was trying to think of one earlier. Genuinely thought. I suppose some people would say, well, somebody like Nigel Farage, in terms of telling it like it is, might get close, at least with reform, even if you fundamentally hate what they stand for, would never vote for them in a million years. You know what they stand for. That's the point.
Yeah, and he had that. He wasn't lofty. He wasn't of the Eton Brigade, of the Cameron Osborne likes.
No.
He was a grammar school boy who made good, and then saw the country and wanted to fix the country, and went to work and railed against many within his own party as the wets of you know, the 1970s and 80s. He wanted to make the country. He hated John Major, but you know, this was a man who wanted to make the you know, in Thatcher's vision, and we have, you know, sometimes it's difficult to define Starmerism. It's even harder to find somebody other than, of course, his chief of staff Morecambe McSweeney, who could actually define Starmerism. But you had with Norman Tebbit, everybody could define Thatcherism, and the embodiment of Thatcherism, not just in Margaret Thatcher, but in Norman Tebbit.
Indeed. Theo, we hit the clock, but thank you.